looking back at why we're looking back on this insane meeting and the insane things that were discussed. So insane that Pat Cipollone doesn't know why he has to tell the January 6th Select Committee why it was such a terrible idea. Well, why? Other than just sheer disbelief that it ever happened in the first place, is because it is now being recognized as a potential new front of criminal exposure for the twice impeached, now indicted ex-president himself. According to a brand new letter to DOJ and the FBI from a legal advocacy group called Free Speech for People, since Trump was presiding over that meeting and heard about this plan, this idea to seize the machines, he was, quote, at a minimum, aware of the unlawful multi-state plot, end quote. The letter cites the transcript of Derek Lyons' testimony to the Jan6th Select Committee. Lyons served as White House staff secretary, and he spoke about how Rudy Giuliani specifically mentioned getting access to voting machines in Georgia in order to find evidence of fraud. The letter from Free Speech for People continues, quote, less media and public attention have been focused on the fact that the testimony also includes references to a parallel plan for non-governmental individuals and entities to access voting systems. The stated goal of this effort to gain access to software and electronic data was to help construct narratives that would support overturning the election. The plan did proceed, and after a few failed attempts, was executed to successfully obtain copies of voting system software in Michigan and in Georgia. All of this boils down to what the New York Times describes this way in reporting over the weekend, quote, allies of Trump ultimately succeeded in copying the election software in those two states. And the breach of voting data in Georgia is being examined by prosecutors as part of a broader criminal investigation into whether Trump and his allies interfered in the presidential election there. The ex-president's participation in the discussion of the Georgia plan could increase his risk of possible legal exposure there. All of it can be viewed in a whole new light following the breaking news we just shared with you minutes ago. Fulton County DA Fani Willis is prepping law enforcement to prepare for indictments this summer. This is where we begin the hour. Joining us now, Democratic Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren of California, a former member of the House Select Committee on January 6th, and Mark Harris is here. He was senior investigative counsel for the January 6th Select Committee. He had the mission specifically of doing some of this investigation into the voting machines. Mark, let me start with you. I saw this story pop up. I read it 3 times. Is this making sure that this crush of work that came out in the final report and the transcripts isn't missed by DOJ? Tell me what this effort is about, as far as you understand it from this advocacy group.
Well, I'm not sure what their motivation was in sending the letter. I do know that it draws heavily on some of the material that's come out in the litigation in Georgia in the Curling versus Raffensperger case that's referenced in the letter. And I know that's material that those folks in that litigation want to see brought to light. And perhaps they've read the report and they can see some of the material that maybe we didn't highlight in the hearings or in the report per se, but they've read the transcripts, and there is a fair amount of material in there that for various space reasons and otherwise wasn't necessarily highlighted, and they seem to think that they want to call attention to it, apparently.
I mean, to be honest, I've heard from a lot of people who've pointed me toward things that were in the transcripts that maybe didn't get a lot of attention. And for in defense of the committee, it was literally being shut down, pushing out information as Kevin McCarthy was getting ready for his what turned out to be ludicrous run for the speakership. But what is it about the 4 referrals and the fact that there isn't really public evidence that anything is imminent from Jack Smith that you think makes groups jumpy and makes them feel like they have to take this step of saying, hey, look here?
Well, this has been going on for over a year now of people who feel that based on what they've seen, that charges should be brought, and they're not happy with the pace at which things are developing. And so oftentimes we see reports or people speaking out publicly saying, well, nothing's happening. Jack Smith isn't doing anything, or what's Fani Willis up to? And then something will come out, a report that people were before the grand jury or there's litigation that reveals that these folks are busy and they are doing their jobs. I was a federal prosecutor for many years, and I know that sometimes things don't work at the pace that certain victims or the public wants to see, but it's moving. And I think the story you just broke at the beginning of this segment suggests that as Senator McCaskill said maybe it's slower than she would like, but things are happening, and she seems like Ms. Willis seems like she has a timetable in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think the anxiety comes from two things. You know, the reality that the behavior is ongoing on Trump's part, and the reality that we are a country at greater risk because domestic violent extremism has intersected with lies about the 2020 election. It's not the fault of either of you two. You've worked to make sure that the truth gets out and gets out quickly. Congresswoman, I want to ask you, just in the plainest way you can explain it, what was Trump's role in the plan to seize voting machines?
Well, as usual, as any good mob boss would, he had others do the nitty-gritty to preserve a little deniability. But there's no question that he knew about it, and I think it's pretty obvious that he was interested in any scheme that would promote his goal of overturning the election. At one point, the acting director of the Department of Homeland Security had to tell him, we can't do that. I mean, it's not permissible. So certainly he was aware of the whole thing. We have testimony from Mr. Giuliani. And by the way, it's great to see Mark again. We worked so closely for so long in the committee. Going back to what we've got online, we were scrambling to get the report done. I think we did a good report, but I was insistent, along with all the other members, that everything get out there, all the transcripts. And I'm confident that the Department of Justice, as well as state prosecutors who are pursuing matters, have thoroughly reviewed what the committee provided. That's what we wanted to have out there. And I'm sure that is factoring into their own processes.
From your lips, Congresswoman, let me take our viewers through the evidence. We've sort of gone back and recreated some of what the group references in their letter. Let me first play some of the testimony that the committee, and in some instances, Mark, you're doing some of this questioning. This is testimony, sworn testimony from Pat Cipollone and Eric Hirschman and others of this meeting.
I don't think any of these people were providing the president with good advice. And so I didn't understand how they had gotten in.
I was asking, like, you claim the Democrats were working with Hugo Chavez, Venezuelans, and whomever else.
I mean, at times there were people shouting at each other, hurling insults at each other. It wasn't just sort of people sitting around on the couch, like, chit-chatting.
Cipollone and Hirschman and whoever the other guy was showed nothing but contempt and disdain of the president.
I think that it got to the point where the screaming was completely out there. I mean, you got people walk in, it was late at night, it had been a long day, and what they were proposing, I thought was nuts.
It might be the only time I believe something Sidney Powell said. Here's Derek Lyons is the lawyer in the middle, not as familiar to people who watch the public hearings, but he speaks after Cipollone and Hirschman, and this is from his transcript. Later in the evening, when he was there in person, Rudy's point of view was that in some way, the campaign, I believe, was going to be able to secure access to voting machines in Georgia through means other than seizure, that, the access would be, I don't know what the right word is, but, voluntary, like it wouldn't be coerced, and that, examination of those machines would begin to show the evidence of the allegations that were being made. How does Rudy, Mark, ever think that? I mean, Raffensperger and his deputy, Gabe Sterling, have been in front of cameras speaking publicly and transparently about the Georgia results, thrice audited. There was never any fraud in Georgia. I mean, what is your sense of the significance of that testimony from Lyons?
So there's been a lot of testimony. We played a fair amount at the hearings, and you see it in the report about the sort of insane, unhinged nature of the fight. That was mostly over these executive orders and whether the president should sign an executive order to seize the machines, and also the issue of whether Sidney Powell should be appointed special counsel to lead that investigation. The part that Derek Lyons is talking about is that at the end of the meeting, towards the end of the meeting, after it had moved from the Oval Office up to the White House residence late on the night of the 18th, Rudy Giuliani came over He was summoned and joined the meeting late and started talking about a plan to voluntarily access the machines. Mr. Giuliani was against the concept of seizing the machines, having the military seize the machines, but he assured the president that there was another plan that he had in the works, and that was to get the machines voluntarily. And as you see in that letter that you cited at the beginning of the segment, through this litigation in Georgia, some details about what actually happened in Georgia have come out. And there's videotape showing that Georgia election officials allowed Trump allies to access the machines, seize the hard drives, and those hard drives have been disseminated, and then they're out, as in one memo on the subject says, in the wild. And so that's the aspect of the scheme that Mr. Lyons was referring to. Ms. Powell and Mr. Giuliani spoke a little bit about it, but we're fairly confident that at that meeting, that topic was brought up in front of the then president.
So let me ask you to put your prosecutor hat back on, Mark. Is this conduct that you believe to be chargeable by Fani Willis? I mean, do you think she's just announced a few minutes ago she's going to be prepared to issue her indictments between July 11th and September 1st? I mean, are these the acts that you thought the committee had mustered plenty of evidence of wrongdoing for?
Well, I'll let Congressman Lofgren talk about sort of the basis for our referral and what the acts were that sort of led to that. But there's no question in my mind that the Fulton County District Attorney is onto this issue based on public reporting. This whole issue of accessing voting machines through the use of public officials. There's been public reporting about some of the people on that video that I alluded to have been brought before the grand jury. So whether that's sort of the basis of the concerns regarding the former president, I can't say. I do know that the accessing of the machines didn't happen until January 7th in Coffee County, which is where this video took place. And there's discussions and there's been some public reporting about how that information was to be used after January or in January. Yeah. So I don't know. I can't say how prominently it figures in DA Willis's assessment.